Hello, AP Worlders. Welcome to Imperialism Part 2. I'm angry because I almost had the whole thing recorded. I clicked the wrong button and erased it. So now this is take 2 of this recording. Many Asian and African people have produced crops to trade. In some places, colonial rule created places that increased cash crop production to the advantage of local farmers. Local small farmers benefit because they were now able to own their own land and buy imported goods. Standard of living improved sharply for these people. It was different for the peasants that were forced to work, however. There were some negatives. It did have an environmental negative, such as destruction of forests, soil depletion. Also, food shortages came because the farmers were focused more on growing cash crops than on food for the people. And third, there were economic dangers that are going to be associated with farming just one or two cash crops. Alright, so, during this time period, a lot of people are going to migrate because of this imperialism. And you're probably asking, why are they going to migrate? I'm going to tell you why. Because they're going to be driven by the need for money, loss of land due to the mother country of the Europeans taking over, or sometimes they're going to be ordered by their colonial authorities. For instance, in Britain, they're going to order some people of India to migrate. Millions of colonial subjects across Asia, Africa, and Oceania sought employment in European-owned plantations, mines, construction projects, and homes. This often required migration to distant work sites. Millions of Chinese, Japanese, and others who were not colonized also joined in this migration for work. The African segment of this migration migration moved in several directions. At first, the Atlantic slave trade was still around, so Africans were moving to Brazil. There was also a large internal migration within Africa. Some Africans are going to migrate to Europe to work, usually in their mother country. The mother country would take possession of their land, leaving them without land of their own. An example of this is in South Africa. A law in 1913 ruled that 88% of the land belonged to the whites, even though there were only 20% of the population. And as you can figure, the 88% of the land that they took was the best land. Many of these migrant workers worked unskilled laborer positions. Skilled labor positions were reserved for the whites. Here's some unskilled laborers. Looks like a sugar plantation. So the migrant workers are going to be paid a fraction of what white workers make, and worked on short-term contracts, and lived in all-male barracks. They were subject to strict control, and women would receive less than the men. Disease was common, and death rates were at least double that of the colony as a whole. Some were indentured laborers. They would receive free passage and enough money to return for 5 to 7 years of labor. The Asian segment are going to move in large numbers to Southeast Asia. Go back to the map. We're going to move to Southeast Asia, the South Pacific, East and South Africa, and the Caribbean islands. In Southeast Asia, huge plantations started, which were financed from Europe. In India, British colonial authorities facilitated the migration of millions of Indians to work sites elsewhere in the British Empire. In the U.S., they would enact a quota to limit Chinese immigration. Other places such as Canada, Australia, and New Zealand also are going to take similar measures to limit Chinese immigration. Some African and Asian migrants are going to move to the cities in their colonial world. These cities were racially segregated and often unsanitary. But these cities were places for these Western educated people to find opportunities as teachers, doctors, and professionals. But most would end up working as clerks in European business offices. Women are going to be affected due to this as well. As demands of the colonies grew, women's lives began to differ from men. Men worked and controlled the cash crops, and women worked the subsistence workload, meaning like the food workload. Also, as men migrated, women were left at home to manage the labor. Historians differ on assessing the colonial development of imperialism. First, the colonial rule did integrate Asian and African economies into the global network of exchange. Some areas within Asia and Africa had begun doing this before colonial rule, so it's hard to say whether it still would have happened had they not been colonized. Second, Europeans helped to modernize these places. Europeans created modern governments there, modern communication and transportation infrastructure, such as railroads, motorways, ports, telegraphs, post office, schools, Western trained army, and healthcare provisions. But third, imperialism or colonial development would stunt the growth of these places. They were going to be unable to industrialize, which is causing them to be faced with high poverty and issues today. Colonial rule did much to culturally change people within the colonized areas. Many changed the way they thought of themselves, their communities, and traditions. One way that they changed the way that they looked at themselves. They started to look at themselves through Western education. European colonizers thought giving them the education was a way of uplifting the backward native race, sort of like a paternalistic obligation. It became known as the white man's burden. Alright, here's a look at some of these indentured servants. You can see they kind of going to start to change the way they dress more European. Alright, here's the political cartoon I think you saw before with the white man's burden, where Europe, United States made it seem like it was their burden that they had to help these backward people. To the colonized people, receiving an education was very important. It was their way to better positions in their social mobility. Many of these new educated people sought European culture and dress. The colonized people would assimilate into European culture. Europeans often refused to treat these Western educated subjects as equals. Religion also provided the basis for new or transformed identities. Most dramatic were those places where widespread conversion to Christianity took place. Areas that didn't already have a dominant religion, such as Islam or Hinduism, would have large numbers of people convert to Christianity. Attraction to Christianity was mainly similar to the Native Americans. When they were defeated militarily, it shook their confidence in their old gods. And Christianity was associated with being educated, so many wanted to convert. The young and the poor and women, all the oppressed groups, and many of these societies found new opportunities and greater freedom if they associated with Christianity. In some areas, local authorities, to strengthen their position, would convert to Christianity to align themselves more with the European. As elsewhere, Christianity in Africa soon would become Africanized. They would add their own cultural spins to it. They would adopt some of their traditional practices, such as charms and medicine. Alright, that's everything for the migration. See you guys in class.